Yeah, let me just try and get comfortable here. There we go. So I don't know how long I'll chat for. Somebody was saying to me today that I should do a chat, but I'm just trying to line this thing up. Hold on a second. Yeah, but as I mentioned in my last video, I've got a bit of a problem with prolonged speech. But I've called this video "The Gatekeeper of the Infinite," which was a phrase I overheard. I'm not sure who said that, "The Gatekeeper of the Infinite." I've been watching a bunch of videos online and reading as much as I can about the inner child, and I can't ascribe that phrase to somebody. There's actually, while my interaction with this inner child as a concept and the actual inner child itself has been fairly new. It just seems to be new to me. There's actually, this is like old knowledge. Like a lot of people know about this in various ways, clearly. And the profundity of it is pretty impressive, I guess, really. You know, there's a lot of the the inner child is like really is really important to deal with this, to come to terms with it, I guess, rather than you don't really deal with it, right? When you say deal with it, it sounds like active, but maybe that's not the way to think about it. The only way you have to deal with the inner child is sort of a more soft kind of way of dealing with it. Oh, before I get into the inner child thing, as you can probably notice, like I seem to have gotten quite a bit better from the paralysis thing. I can smile a bit, but it's a work in process. But every day it's getting a little bit better, and hallelujah, right? The inner child, the gateway to the infinite. So it may have been, I hate to even say this. It may have been that lady, what's her name, Gabby Bernstein, who's like the pop author. But was it her who said it or somebody else who said it? But it was one of these people who said this, and it was like I was like, wow, that's pretty impressive. And it sort of dovetails with what Hilmar was saying a few years ago about the inner child and how basically that's what Hilmar said too, is that he didn't use those precise words, but basically the gateway to the infinite kind of a thing, right? And what does that mean, Scott? Dude, it's so profound. And the funny thing about it is as you move into this space, it proves itself to be true. So it's like a good example of this is the Presence Process book, which I've spoken about a few times now, which was recommended by Krister, the Rasa guy, and a few other people. But that Presence Process book, dude, that book is really profound. Let me just make a note because there was something else I wanted to talk about this. This is the externalization of fire. Externalization of, I want to talk about that. That's a concept from that book. Gateway to the infinite. I think the whole idea with the gateway to the infinite is this: is that essentially what everybody likes to say is we're infinite beings, right? We're infinite beings and we have access to all things, but not really, because nobody seems to have access to all things, right? So it's kind of a theory, it's a hypothetical, right? That maybe you might have access to the infinite, but nobody seems to be able to have access to the infinite unless they do drugs or something, right? And what's the barrier, right? What's the barrier? So a lot of people say it's the shadow. The shadow's the barrier, or your awareness, or there's a whole bunch of reasons people come up with, right? But this inner child concept's a pretty good sort of general idea of what's preventing the awareness of infinite awareness. And by infinite awareness, we're talking about enlightenment, basically. That's what it is, right? Is basically enlightenment. And our inability to deal with the inner child is what causes us to not be enlightened. I think that's it at the end. Um, and of course, there's the more you contemplate this, the more sort of aspects there are of this, especially in this surprising context, which is what Hilmar first brought up, and it's come up in other places too, about the inner child actually being some kind of Christ archetype. Um, and you know, feel free to discard the baggage of the Christian Christ. It's just it's beyond that. It's beyond anything Christianity has to. It's beyond anything which I've learned from Christianity. But the Christ image does seem to keep coming up quite a lot with it. It comes up quite a bit. Um, hey, vegan dolls. I'm a little bit better. Vegan dolls a little bit better. You know. But all right, that's a big smile. It's actually quite good because I just look really sardonic all of them. So this Christ image keeps coming up quite a bit, amazingly, which wasn't something which I expected, but I think part of the thing is that what happens is this is what I was trying to say is when you get into the I think it's in step 7. The presence process is like a 10-step process to pure presence, which amazingly you get to pure presence, parentheses, enlightenment, by coming to terms with the inner child. That's what the presence process is actually about, right? That's what the book is about. It's about becoming enlightened through coming to terms gently and softly with the inner child. And so in step 7 of that book, he discusses. Man, I lost my place again. In step 7, probably as vegan dolls. In step 7 of that book, what happens in step 7, Scott? Something important happens. I forgot what it was. I lost my place again. What do we do in step 7? Man, this is really not very compelling when you forget the point, right? Let me just get back into the whole general vibe again. So as we're moving into, okay, so it's an enlightenment process. We're moving into pure presence, and we have to come to terms with this inner child construct. And so it's actually really surprising that this is the barrier. So what's funny about it is because like the inner child is a concept which I personally have sort of poo-pooed, like well, a bunch of bullshit, and it's sort of taken that way by a lot of people. Like, how could this even be? It just seems like such an imaginary concept, right? And that's actually something that Michael Brum brings up in the presence process, is that the inner child. The funny thing about the inner child is it feels, when you hear that phrase, inner child, it seems like some imaginary construct. But what's amazing about the inner child is it's not imaginary, it's not a construct, and it actually makes up at least 50% of what you describe as your personality. Probably more, probably 80%, probably 90% of your personality is, let's say 70% of your personality is probably being guided by reverberations from the inner child. And I don't want to say reverberations, because reverberations implies something that's sort of like it's almost like hidden away, and it's not really hidden away. It's like really, once you become aware of it, it's like really obvious. It's like really obvious and really demanding attention, like a lot. And it's funny, you know, I remember reading the book, or part of the book, Exegesis by P.K. Dick. Exegesis was his book where he was describing what happened with Philip K. Dick, the writer who did Blade Runner, is he he went through this stage where he was experimenting with drugs and stuff, and he sort of stopped doing that, and he was doing like vitamin C injections, and he was trying to be he's trying to be super hyper healthy, and then one day he somebody came to the front door, and he opened up the door, and he saw a pink beam of light come out of their. They had a necklace. It was actually it was one of those fish. It was one of those Christian fish necklaces, I think it was, and this pink beam of light came out of it and hit him in the forehead, and that some people say that's when he went crazy. But what he ended up describing was over a period of time, he realized that he was sharing his consciousness with some guy from ancient Greece. Now, I'm not comparing this to the inner child. I'm not saying that this is the inner child. I am going to sort of compare it to this. Um, and so what happened was over the course of time was Philip K. Dick hated drinking wine, but the Greek guy from ancient Greece really liked wine. And so there was this weird like intersection of these two consciousnesses from different time periods. So this sort of explains a lot of his crazy time shifting writing. So that's sort of a crazy experience. Like, oh wow, poor Philip K. Dick. Like he really went crazy, that guy, right? And wow, thank God I'm not like him, right? But what I would suggest to you is actually the inner child is working like that in you. Like our consciousness is actually being shared and modulated heavily by this inner child. And the inner child seems to have various manifestations. I know that Hilmar was saying there's a whole bunch of them at different ages. Um, and I think part of this is like, because, like people say that, we're, live in the now, right? Live in the now. And so generally, that now moment always exists. So the child, what once was you as a child, still exists because the now is all that exists. So that moment still exists, right? Now, what happens is we tend not to think that way because as adults, that's interesting. As adults, I mean, one of the things that one of the interesting points that Michael Brown points out is that basically we're basically living in an alternate dimension already, right? So Philip K. Dick is not the exception. Basically, we're all living in another dimension. So all of us are either living or modulating between the future and the past and completely skipping over the present moment, right? Completely skipping over it and forcing ourselves into future. And the future and the past don't actually exist. These are like constructs, or they're spaces created by the mind through which we can not be present. Now, a lot of the mind space that's created by that is seems to be created by trauma and this kind of stuff, right? Now, this is an interesting thing about this because like personally, I don't think of myself as super traumatized, but then as you look into the presence process, yeah. No, I remember what I was going to say. When you get to the step 7 of the presence process, there's an interesting thing that Michael Brown points out. Basically, he's got a few practices you go through to sort of identify the trauma which is emerging. And what happens is as you identify it, certain physical things start happening to you. And so that's happening to me. So it's like it sort of self-proves itself. So as you're working with it, it kind of like, oh, that is what it is, right? Because it's not like a typical feeling you might have. If something specifically happens, right? I think that's a good idea, vegan dolls, that kind of stuff, Um, and the other thing that Michael Brown was pointing out was that, like when is that when you become traumatized, like Vegan Dolls was saying there, that usually like your personality is formed by 5. Michael Brown, I think, says it's when you're 7. He sees it as 7-year cycles, but then he also mentions that might change based on based on modern society. I thought, yeah, that seemed like the whole thing about compassion and recognition is, yeah, it's really it is simple, and yet like it's like I think, and it's simple, but in order to be able to do it, you actually have to sort of be mindful and contemplative, and you should have, sort of have to be thoughtful about it, which is not high on the list of priorities for a lot of people, especially when it comes to themselves. People tend to be quite harsh on themselves and not be kind to themselves. And exactly, man, it's too new age wanky, right? And made me. I feel the same way. And yet I'm doing this. The presence process book, going through this, has been like one of the most profound things I've ever done in my life. It's so amazing. And it's like I said a few times, the presence process is basically plant medicine put into words, because it's such a perfectly articulated plan. It's like a 10-week meditational plan, and sort of contemplation plan with some simple guides about how to deal and how to recognize the emergence of trauma, and then how to sort of try and deal with it as it comes up, like in a soft and compassionate way. And so it's really funny. So one of the things that happens is you have to become, yeah, Valis is a great book. Um, when these, well, one of the things is you try and watch for these sort of signals coming up, which are, I think he calls them reflections, which are it's basically the trauma pushing out a reflection into your consciousness. This is coming from an inner child who's trying to get your attention. And typically, what happens, it turns out, is that what we do is, in order not to deal with the trauma, is we medicate it with alcohol, caffeine, tobacco, sex, what else? Drugs, anything to not deal with the trauma. And part of the reason this happens, I guess, is like Michael Brown was saying, is that when the trauma is inflicted, and this doesn't have to be like you got raped by whatever. It can just be any kind of smaller trauma. But the problem is it happens when you're a youth, when you're quite young. Your mental body is not formed, so the trauma is pushed into the emotional body, and there's no mental constructs. So that's why it's so easily forgotten, because there's no trail, there's no word trail. Now, I'm pretty sure that a lot of the trauma, like you've got personal trauma, but I'm pretty sure there's like ancestral trauma too. Because like I'm dealing with stuff, and it's like I don't even think that's me that's coming from. Like there's stuff that comes up, and it's like, how, what? I mean, maybe it is, and then you think, and you hear about these people who go to psychologists, right? And then there's like, they're like, no, I'm fine, and then they after 3 weeks or 3 weeks later, they're like, they think they were sold into like a cult when they were 3 years old. It's like, what? But the thing is, this sort of stuff comes up, and you're like, and the funny thing is, I mean, the thing with me is like I've noticed that these reflections, because what happens is like the reflections come up, and if you don't, the way Michael Byrne defines it is like if you suppress it, what happens is you end up projecting. It's like you sort of you repress it, and then you reproject the trauma somewhere else. Is what happens, kind of thing. And the part of the process and the presence process is to not do that. Is to try and sit compassionately with the trauma, and release the trauma. So what I've noticed with myself is like it's like every 15 minutes I get like some trauma coming up. It's really like, what? Why is that happening? And you don't think it's trauma, but then when you go through the process, you're thinking, okay, let me just try and recognize what's coming up, and and for me, I mean, it's difficult to tell. For me, it's often manifested in an urge to like get more coffee or something. It's like an addictive thing, right? Some kind of addictive behavior, which, and this typically happens, is these addictive behaviors are actually chained together, and are identified with as the personality. And this is why it's the key to this, the gateway to the infinity. Because what happens is once you deconstruct these chains of, I mean, these are literally the veil. The veil between infinity and identity is it's the chains of trauma, right? That's the key. So in order to truly become enlightened, you have to sort of deconstruct your own trauma. And it's not, and I don't even want to use the word deconstruct because deconstruction is an intellectual process. And this is certainly not an intellectual process. And what's funny about this is one of the things that Michael Brown was talking about is like, he's like, when you see the reflection come up, and then you avoid the addictive behavior, and then you try to identify where it's coming up in the body, right? Which, and the funny thing is I've heard all this stuff before a million times, but it's just this particular book is connected with me, right? And and then you try and identify like what is the trauma, like, and then you try and be compassionate. You try and compassionately accept it, right? Or kind of a thing. And one of the things that Michael Brown discusses there is that when that happens, he discusses this sort of emergence of energy coming through the body. So this was before I got the facial paralysis, but that was like a few weeks before that. Like I was doing this for the first time, and I had this huge. I was just sitting here, and all of a sudden, my heart chakra opened up. And it's really funny because, like, as you know, I mean, I've been thinking to myself for quite some time as a bit of an expert with the chakras. Like I can work with energy and move energy and do all. It's like I get complete fluency with energy, right? It's crazy. I don't know why, but but I'm not as smart as I thought I was. So I would yeah, nothing prepared me for the opening of the heart chakra. That was like it was really just a different experience. And it's like the third eye, like having visions and opening up the third eye gets so much attention. It gets so much press, right? It's like, oh, the third eye, you can, right? You can astral project, you can evoke spirits and stuff, and it's like, but the heart chakra, it was really, yeah, it's really changed my whole outlook on the whole world. I'm still coming to terms with it, and it hasn't permanently opened. It keeps opening up though. Like what happens is every time I go into this space, of compassion, dude, it just it's interesting. What happens is like when you open up your third eye, right? It's like there's a pulsing up here all the time, right? Like I always have this, it's like a pulsing energy in the third eye. And so that kind of happens in the heart chakra too, but it just feels different. Like I guess in some ways it's a size thing. It's like the pulse in the third eye is maybe about this size, but the heart chakra is like literally like it's like a big space just opens up, and it just emanates. It's a different order of intelligence, right? So it's a different order of intelligence, which is which isn't really visionary. It's not really visionary intelligence. Although it was, to be honest with you, it was I don't know if I've told this story already because I haven't been online for a while, but there was I did a video a while back, maybe a month or so ago, and I ended up putting it in the member section because I thought it was dangerous, where I was talking about moving into the space of the Buddhas, and in that video I described a technique for meditation, using what is known as the dangerous kriya. And using the dangerous Kriya, you can apparently move into this. Well, what happened to me is I was using it and I just moved into this space of the Buddhas, and that was really impressive. Anyway, I after that happened, like I had like a big flood of light coming down my brain, and during that flood of light down here, it went into my heart, and so I think that flood was like the no when that went down into my heart, it didn't feel like the heart was opening, but something happened, but it was distinct from the actual heart chakra opening. But I think it was some kind of like something happened. I don't know what it was, but something happened. So I think that was the beginning of it all. And I would say also that all this stuff, like my energy levels have like 10x'd. And like if you watch any of my videos, I get no problems like with energy, but like the energy levels have been multiplied by 10 ever since I started working with Tomer. I did a video with Tomer a few months ago. Like I did his astral projection course and had some success with it. But but he's a tantra teacher, and he works with the Shivoham Tantra group in India, and they're like a Sri Vidya Tantra group. So I've been working with him for the last few months with some mantra stuff, and it's ever since I started working with those mantras, like my energy levels gone off the friggin' charts, just crazy. And also that those mantras guided me into some of these things. I'm not sure if that was their intention. Like the second mantra he gave me was a mantra for spiritual protection, um, and that, yeah, I think some people might just do the mantra and just recite the words, but I tend to sort of be intuitive about it and sort of I've got a style of working with mantras where there's sort of different ways of investigating the mantra. So as you recite it, you can move consciousness through the shapes of the syllables, like the actual. So there's different types of shapes. You can actually move the consciousness your consciousness through the letters, or you could move it through the sort of sounds, like what do you call that? The fricatives and the different sort of vocalic sounds, and you could allow consciousness to explore these things as you're reciting it. Um, then you could explore the mantra in different body parts, and you can explore. There's lots of different ways of exploring a mantra, right? And so that's how I ended up moving into the brain, and that's also that same mantra brought me to the presence process. Because Krister mentioned the presence process to me a year or so ago, and I read it and was like, whatever. But then when I was doing those mantras, it brought me back to them. It brought me back to it again, right? Or what happened was I stumbled upon them again online, and at the time I was like working with the mantra pretty deeply, I felt like it was guiding me towards the spiritual protection it was providing me. Wasn't what it seemed to be guiding me back to myself, and so the whole presence process seemed to be sort of getting sort of dovetailed into this process, which is why I say it was bringing me back to it, right? um, so the heart chakra is like a whole different language. It's really interesting. You know, there's a funny video, which I often post this video. I post it a couple of times a year. And it's Ram Dass. It's Ram Dass and Maharaji. It's such a great video. Let me just see if I can find it here. Ram Dass and Maharaji. And this is such an awesome video. Can I switch? Can I put this on? It's just such a beautiful story, this thing. And is this the one? Hold on a second. I don't know if I can switch my. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can switch my camera around here. Hold on a second.
I was looking for somebody that could read the maps of my consciousness. I found Maharaji. He was the map. I met Maharaji in a little temple in the mountains, the Himalayas. I had been traveling with a young Westerner.
I'll also let it play for a couple of minutes here, just so you can see this thing.
India for many months.
I loved this video.
And so he knew his way around.
So I took him in the Land Rover up the mountains to meet Neem Baba. Against his will. He was really uptight, angry, didn't want to go. Was giving me a hard time, was mad because I was driving. He wanted to drive.
We stopped on the way about 100 miles from the temple. And we stopped, and I went outside from the house, and the stars, like stars, Van Gogh, those stars. And I thought of my mother. She was dead 6 months. And then I went inside, and we went on to the Guru.
Ramdas first met Maharaji right here. Maharaji was sitting here with all these devotees were here, and he came here with Bhagwan Das. So it is a tradition here just to bow down before a saint. So Bhagwan Das bowed down and pranamed, but Ramdas was a bit hesitating.
He's laying on his belly on the ground, touching the feet of the Guru. And I was Harvard professor. I wasn't going to go up and touch somebody's feet.
He had his hands in his pockets and just watching. And
so he said, come, this. Sit down. Then he said, you were out under the stars thinking of your mother last night. Which, I mean, a Harvard professor, knowing, having been in cognitive research and stuff like that, nothing made me ready for that.
You were remembering your mother. She died of a spleen.
And that was the breakthrough. That was the quieting my mind. Quieting my mind.
It's like Jesus when he met the woman at the well and told her everything she'd ever done. That's what Maharaji would do. He would tell us everything that we've been doing in the last parts of our lives. You're thinking, wow, he knows everything.
When Maharaji was near me, I was bathed in love. And because he knew everything about me, that was like I was forgiven. I think prior to that, I had a lot of things in my past. I didn't want anybody to know. And I always felt that if they knew, they wouldn't love me. He knew, and he loved me.
And then he was transformed into Baba Ramdas before my very eyes. He just turned into this love, just started pouring. He just totally opened his heart and got into his heart.
It was so beautiful. It was so beautiful. It was so beautiful.
How do I...
Yeah, so I think that was the part I wanted to show you. So yeah, so that whole thing there, dude, I love that video, man. That's just so moving. But what it describes is an intellectual man who, in his own words, Harvard professor, involved with cognitive studies, right? But then what happens is boom, the heart's opened, right? So that's what Neil, what's his name? Karami Blah, can't even say his name, right? So that's what the guru did to Ram Dass, is heart opening, changed his life instantly. So all of a sudden, what happens is the intellect goes to service for the heart, right? So the intellect goes to service for the heart. Now, this is opposed to some people, some of whom I've interviewed, whose intellect rules everything, and it's a grave error in judgment to do that, right? So this whole thing about the whole thing about not dealing with the inner child is that's an intellectual process, right? It's advanced intellect rationalizing the necessity of working with the inner child. And what's funny about that there is the argument, which, what the hell's his name? I know his name. I just can't pronounce it right now. It's Nikaroli Baba, I think it is, right? The argument the guru had there, the argument wasn't an intellectual argument, right? It wasn't intellectual. It was a specific petition to love, right? The love of his mother, the contemplation of the love of his mother in the mystical space of the stars in India. And so you get this sort of the mother inside the stars, inside, it's almost like it's like a pregnant metaphor of the mother inside the stars inside of India. And that structure has more truth than any logical construct, right? Because you can't undermine. You see, the thing is, those categories of the those categories which emerge from the heart structure, which are based on archetypal or love archetypes, right? Some kind of love archetypes. So we're not even, it could be romantic love, but in this case, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the emergence. You see, from romantic love emerges many archetypes, such as like the family, the mother, the father, the child, right? All these archetypes emerge, which are pretty much eternal archetypes of divinity. And especially in our society, they get destroyed, berated. It's and the funny thing is that that whole purpose of destroying and berating those archetypes, which is happening today on many levels, is emerging from intellectual constructs, right? It's from the mind, right? The attack on divinity comes from the mind. Huh. So I'm just sitting here. What's happening is I'm sitting here. My mind, or I'm just sort of gliding. I'm sort of moving in and out of those archetypes right now. I can just feel them, and they're so perfect. They're so perfect, I know that I interviewed Giorgiani, right? And Giorgiani's thing is his whole thing is about using technology and re-engineering humanity. And I said to him at one point, and like, dude, this is all intellect. It's not. But it's so easy to neglect the power of the. You see, those archetypes, they're emerging from they emerge from this. What happens is when the heart chakra opens, like there's a bunch of stuff that happens to, but there's like what happens is there's like you might imagine there's like a ray of love, right? There's a ray of love that comes out of the heart chakra. That sounds like it's plausible, right? It is, but what happens is when that ray is, I don't even know if it's a ray, but there's this energy of love. But if you investigate the energy of love, what you discover is there's variations in that. There's stuff that we have no idea exists in there, right? So in that eminence, and it's almost calling it loves. It's not really enough because we've such a sort of pedestrian idea of what love means, right? So like love is literally like this creation language, which but the thing is that it's got modalities, or it's beyond modalities. Yeah, I mean I've seen it, but it's like you can't really describe it. It's just really it's beyond what we can understand, right? And there's this huge flow. So the funny thing is like what you've got is you got a bunch of people who don't even know that exists, trying to berate it and destroy it. And clearly, I'm talking about a bunch of different like social movements at the moment, like the transgender movement, the what else? The anti-family movements, the woke movements, all the stuff. It's all what is it? They're all mental. They're all mental constructs, right? And I think and not only are they mental constructs, but they seem to emerge from trauma, right? They seem to emerge from trauma, right? And so what happens is rather than people dealing with the trauma, what they're doing is they're projecting new philosophies out of the trauma and trying to pull those into reality. So what you end up with you might end up with really quite articulate language, which is emerging from distorted energy structures, which is, I think, is pretty much what's going on. And in the case of Giorgiani thinking that you can use artificial intelligence to make this work, it's just a fool's game. It's just not going to work because the underlying because what seems clear is when the heart opens, it just supersedes everything. It supersedes the third eye. It's just really, it's like what? And it really emerges like as a different language of life and eternal radiance and eternal life and eternal creativity. And what it is, it's the pure presence. That is the pure presence. And so the way you access this, and the way I'm accessing it is through the dissolution of trauma, because the trauma is the veil, right? But what happens is people identify trauma as their identity, right? There's a guy I like to watch who talks about Ukraine a lot, and he thinks he's a pretty cool guy, right? And exactly, Jimbo, right? And this guy, I'm watching him, and he's a pretty smart guy, but he's talking, but he's sitting there and he's smoking a cigarette, right? And he's and I'm just watching, and he's a smart guy, but I'm just watching him, but he's smoking up a storm. And what's funny about the smoking is he's got specific mannerisms. You know how people that they get their and they've got their little mannerisms. And what's happened is their whole identity what's happened is they've got a nervous reaction to trauma, which is manifested into cigarettes, and not only that, but they've wound their identity around it. It's like one of those creeping plants. You ever seen those creeping plants which wind their way around the fences, and then they grow and they grow, and it looks like they're in the form of the fence, but they're actually using the fence as their crutch. And so what happens is these people, and I'm the project onto him, of course. This could never happen to me, right? But like what happens, and I'm the same way with coffee, like but what happens is you project your identity onto the trauma. You think this is who I am. Dude, I've got like 6 different kinds of coffee machines here to make coffee in different ways. And it's a fascinating process. And it's all about building a construct. It's a constructed identity of trauma. Dude, it's unbelievable. I feel a little foolish about it, to be honest with you, because it's like, because it all seems so obvious now, but like, damn. And the funny thing is, I watch it coming up. I'm still not dealing with it perfectly. It's like, it comes up, and you will have a cup of coffee, and you're like, dude, and then you're like, oh, I fell for it, right? And but you've just got to be really soft and try and sort of come to terms. Okay, that's what it is. Try and deal with this. Try and be soft about this. And so what's funny about this too is like, it's changed the way I think about a whole bunch of stuff. So for example, a couple of years ago, I was doing classes. I did a few classes online, right? And the way I did the classes was like, at the time I was feeling this huge energy flow, right? So that's really cool. But so that seemed like the thing to teach. But it was I did it in quite an intellectual way. So I was doing a lot of research and pulling a lot of research into the classes. And it's funny because there's this other lady online, you've probably seen her. She's called Gigi Young, and she tends to do. She's done stuff with the black. What's he called? The black journalist, whatever he's called. What's that guy called? Yeah, but she does a lot. She does a lot. She does quite. She does. She's a psychic apparently, but she released one of her classes because she does like a lot of online classes, and I was laughing because basically what she's doing is it's an intellectual class. She's reading Steiner. So basically, it's basically an analysis of Rudolf Steiner is what it is, her class, right? And which is great. I mean, because those things are interesting, but in a way, any intellectual approach to this stuff is almost the wrong approach, right? Because all intellect is like it's a programmed projection away from into the mind, right? It's a program projection into the mind. I did an interview a little while ago, a couple of years ago, with what's her face, Imogen Sita, and she's really nice. She does a lot of like free transmissions and stuff, and we did a transmission in that video, and what's interesting about her is she lived with her boyfriend. They lived with Muji, right? Muji gets like mixed ratings and stuff, but I started investigating maybe a year ago, and I gotta tell you, man, I just think Muji is the best teacher. I just think he's such an amazing teacher, that guy. He's got a lot of satsangs. Like, just go and watch some of his satsangs. Some of them are really long. You'll get like 3 hours. And dude, there's nothing like a Muji satsang. Dude, that guy, what's great about that guy is it's completely not intellectual. He's not trying to teach you. He's not going to, dude, he works with you, right? He works with you. So you just listen to him, and he slowly just talks to people where they're at. They start telling him a story, and he just softly guides them towards pure awareness. It's unbelievable. And so often what happens is as you're listening to him, you're like, oh, you'll find yourself in pure awareness yourself, because he just softly guides you there. And this is completely simple language, not intellectual, just quietly asking questions and do this and try this. I just think he's a genius teacher. Really good and non-intellectual. He certainly can be intellectual. He's not a stupid guy, but he's just but he doesn't do it. It's just this it's just to focus on the matter at hand, which is interesting because like the funny thing is about it is when you're focusing on the chakras. I mean, there's all this stuff you got to learn. Like, okay, what? How many petals are there? What do all those words mean? Right? It can be an intellectual process. Now, it can also not be an intellectual process, right? You can I should try that, Jimbo. Yeah, I haven't really watched any of those. That's the Papaji, right? But like there's ways of working with the chakras which are not intellectual, right? And it shouldn't be intellectual really. It should be more of a well, there's a bunch of ways of doing it with it, right? There's so many ways of working the chakras which are so powerful that it's unbelievable. Um, yeah. Uh, what's interesting is in the presence process, Michael Brown talks about the part of his thing. He calls this connected breathing. So like you've got a mantra like every week. Um, he doesn't call it a mantra. He calls it it's a mantra. But like so, this what's the one this week? The mantra this week is I. I always forget the freaking mantras. It's something like I. It's not discharge. I'm going to say discharge. It'll come to me. It's I discharge my negative emotional charge. So the word's not discharge. It's like I release my negative emotional charge. Something like that. But when you say this, you're supposed to do this 15 minutes in the morning and in the evening, right? And you do this during connected breathing. So connected breathing is just breathing, not heavy, just breathing in and out and being aware of the breath. And the whole thing is about being aware of the breath and just the breath. Because what happens is the breath is in real time. The breath, you may have seen me post this week that the breath is really sacred. Um, yeah, the breath is the primary pillar of presence in the human body, basically, right? So that's like, I'm not sure if it's the first pillar, but it's like a holy thing. The breath is holy, right? Which is really funny because we don't think that way, right? We take ourselves to be unholy, right? The breath itself is holy. And so I mean if you extrapolate out from that, I mean what? I mean if the breath is holy, what does it, that must mean there's a whole bunch of holy things going on. I'm just going to close the door here. It's getting a little cold out there. That means there's a whole bunch of like holy stuff going on in our bodies, right? In our minds, in our lives, which we're completely unaware of. And not only that is that we tend to consistently denigrate ourselves and be cruel to ourselves and unkind to ourselves, and which is crazy because there's this because basically this is divinity. It's a divine construct. So this whole thing about the heart chakra opening up and its significance about the non-intellectual significance. In some ways, like a lot of my videos tend to move into intellectual ideas, and I really enjoy exploring them. But I'm just thinking that it's almost better to be Muji like and just this is what people just call holding space. It's like holding space. It's holding space with the shared awareness of divinity. Yeah. Holding space in the shared awareness that divinity is real in the world which has 1,000 technologies to prove to you intellectually that it's not real. There are things which are so astonishing in this world, which are unseen. For some reason, I seem to have access to a lot of them. But, and I don't know why, you know. Maybe it's just from doing too many plant medicines or whatever. I don't know, but like it's, last week I went to my bed. I lay down in my bed and I've got this like bedside light. It's like one of those, have you ever seen those things? It's like a vaporizer. You put in essential oils and it vaporizes, but it's got lights in it too. And I haven't used it for a while, but I just keep it on for the lights now, you know. And the other night it was on and it was in the green light. It was stuck in the green. So I get into my bed and I just lie down and I'm just looking at the green light. I'm like, wow, that's really beautiful. And dude, I just go into visions for like 2 hours, just hardcore. It was like a full ayahuasca trip, but I was just lying there, just like, wow. And it was just, and it was like, it's just part of consciousness. But it was just like access in. Now it was also like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, I was doing a lot of the medicine for the facial paralysis. So it may have been coming from some of that medicine, like really opening me up, you know, but like, it's unbelievable, man. And the news, the people on the news, the pundits who tell you about what significance the family has, dude, they've got no idea what they're talking about. They just really have people don't realize the breath is sacred, right? Like, so if you're not operating from the fundamental principle that breath is a sacred pillar of divinity in this world, and it is, sorry. I mean, I get it that it's not patently obvious because I've been there, right? And like most of the day, I'm not thinking it's a pillar of divinity either. But then there's moments where it's just revealed, and you're like, oh, forgot about that. Yeah, that really changes the whole perspective and everything. And then all these other divine archetypes are everywhere. Everything is a reflection of divinity. Everything. And what happens is the mind, like the collective hive conscious mind, as it emerges from Shakti into humanity, is flitting through these structures, trying to imagine that it somehow it's created and manipulable by humanity. It's so ridiculous. It's so silly and wrong-minded. Getting back to the inner child, you know, you look at all the stuff that's the projection of trauma. Then you look at all this nonsense that's going on politically in Ukraine and stuff. You're like, dude, this is such a projection of trauma. This whole thing is so outrageous what's going on, you know. And so, I mean, try telling Zelensky he needs to do some inner child work, or Joe Biden needs to do some inner child work, right? Or the neocons need some inner child work. Good luck. I mean, so there is a thing which people seem to say in many pathways, and it's like the only thing you can really do is work on yourself. And as you resolve your own traumas, then that resolution is going to reflect out. I mean, there is this idea, there's this potential idea that the pivot of reality is actually you, right? So somehow the pivot of or the central energy point is reflecting out from us. Now, Michael Brown in the presence process talks a lot about this. So one of the things he talks about is like like when you meet somebody who annoys you or something like this, these people have been projected out from you, right? Your trauma is projecting this out in an attempt to get you to deal with your trauma, which sounds to the uninitiated, this sounds far-fetched, but it doesn't really seem that far-fetched once you've done this process a few times, you know? It actually seems like it's reasonably probable that that's what's happening. And so maybe that's what can happen, you know, like as we come to deal with our own traumas more, maybe the whole world becomes more organized and calmer. It's certainly true that the more I deal with this stuff, it's the more that, like, dude, I've had so many like struggles in my life, but the more I deal with this stuff, like everything just sort of becomes easy, right? Everything just sort of starts. It's almost like the whole manifestation thing. You know, people are trying to manifest stuff, but if you just deal with the trauma, then it dissolves the structures. It's almost like there's these like magnetic elastic structures chaining you into the wheel of samsara. It's trauma which is doing it, personal and karmic, ancestral. And so the more you can deal with this stuff, the more you peel that stuff off, then all of a sudden things just get lighter. And that lightness can be weighed in consciousness. Like the actual sensation of conscious energy changes. And this actually brings me to an interesting point is and this will probably be my last point because I'm kind of ranting here and the internet's going to die in about 4 minutes, is like Michael Brown talks about this because I think in chapter 6 in step 6 or 7 he talks about the elements, the elemental process, and how the emotional body is the water element, but is being it's in flames, right? Our emotional body's in flames, and as it's in flames, those flames are being projected out into the physical reality. That's how he describes it. And so what we have to do is we have to neutralize the fire element in the emotional body, which goes back to a lot of what Franz Bourdon was talking about, right? So it's neutralizing the fire element. And there's a whole bunch of ways of doing this. The obvious ways are breaking addictive behaviors, um, being nice to yourself, being kind. That whole ho'oponopono, the Hawaiian prayer, which you hear people talking about this, was like the ho'oponopono prayer is, what is it? It's like, I'm sorry. What is it? Please forgive me. I love you. Thank you. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I love you. Thank you. That didn't make any sense to me. Seems nice, but didn't make any sense to me. But when you apply it to the inner child and you're saying, I'm sorry, and you're sorry for ignoring the obvious messages which you didn't realize were there. Please forgive me for ignoring them. I love you. Thank you. Those are the kind of things you might say to a small child, right? So it's this process of forgiving, asking for forgiveness from the inner child. Because what happens is like a belligerent child. You know, like if you get like a really angry kid and you take them out and they go fucking ballistic at the supermarket, you can't win. You can't win that game, man. So this is what's happening inside of you. But it's like 1,000 times worse than that. It's like really bad because the inner child lives outside of time, right? So it feels alone. It's lost outside of time and with no contact. And so what you have to do is you have to break out because you're flitting back and forth between the future and the past. The inner child is lost. So you have to move, you have to come out, you literally have to move into presence. And the inner child, through its vibrational concordance, will sort of pull you into that vibrational state, right? Of presence. Yeah, that idea of the fragmented self has come up quite a bit. That's one of those phrases I heard years ago, and I was like, "What are they talking about, man?" But it's pretty clear that that's what it is. You know, it's the fragments, right? And the way it's really important. This stuff. Anyway, my internet literally dies at like 9 o'clock, so it's 9 p.m. here. I probably got a couple of minutes before it dies, but I think I'll wrap it up. Like, I'm amazed I talked for an hour. You know, I don't look like I'm paralyzed. I'm still pretty paralyzed, right? But it's going away though, right? Eyebrows are going up now. Eyes are closing now. I did a video in the members section where, dude, I was watching it today, dude. I look really screwed up there, but it's way more back to normal. Thank God, dude. So yeah. So just the breath is divine, and it's sacred divinity. Just the breath. And then the Recognition Sutras mentions that sight, uh, hearing, taste, touch, smell are all sacred emanations of divinity too. And so the more you contemplate that, it's just amazing, dude. Like, if you've got any like wherewithal with energy, and you put yourself into the energy and then you contemplate those ideas, dude, that's like instant move into like pure consciousness doing that. It's unbelievable, dude. Okay, out of here. Peace and love, you guys. Let's hope I get better. I hope you guys all are well, and God bless all of you. Take care.